All right, well, good morning and welcome everybody to our mid-morning Chicago Research Summit session. So it is my privilege to introduce our speaker for the next 20 or 30 minutes, which is Michelangelo Giampaoli. He's coming to us from DePaul University, and his session is titled Roots Matter, Chicago Cemeteries, a proposal for social empowerment. So I will turn it over to Michelangelo.
I was mute. Hello, Matt. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, everybody, for attending this presentation. I would like to start my presentation by sharing a PowerPoint I have made with you. I tried to add as many pictures as I could to the PowerPoint because I think it's interesting and important to see the things we are discussing. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and hopefully you will be able to see it. Is everything okay with the screen, Matt?
Yes, I can see it. It looks good.
Perfect. So again, thank you very much for having me here. And my name is Michelangelo Giampaoli. I'm a cultural anthropologist, cultural heritage curator, and I am passionate for cemeteries. I've been working with cemeteries for maybe more than 15 years now in Italy, France, Brazil, and now the US. And being a cultural anthropologist, I look at cemeteries are places where the living people go and do things. They can be ritual, it can be tourism, it can be other activities. So I'm mostly interested in the human activities in cemeteries as places of daily life, and of course, as places of education too. To be honest, when I start visiting the cemeteries of Chicago, I wasn't looking for the memory of the African-American community. I was more interested in my ethnic group, in the memory and the heritage of Italian and American Italians in Chicago. You know, we have a big Italian community in Chicago. What happened is that the more I was visiting Chicago cemeteries, and the more I was able to discover a huge number of monuments and graves of personalities, mostly African-American personalities. And actually, this presentation, I will be honest, is both a confession of my ignorance. I didn't know many of these personalities, maybe because I'm a foreigner, and maybe because I should be a better reader in terms of African-American culture and history. And this is also an example of how cemeteries can be important to educate people like me and like many of our students. When you start visiting the cemeteries of Chicago, you probably start with Graceland. Graceland is a fantastic place, one of the most beautiful cemeteries I have seen in the US. And it's in Graceland that I start knowing more the contribution of African-American community to the history of Chicago and the US. This is the first grave which really kept my attention. I have no idea who Ernie Banks was. I'm not a baseball fan. As an Italian, I follow soccer mostly. But of course, this grave was absolutely fascinating to me for many reasons. The monument, the offerings, the gift left by some people on the grave, baseballs, and also because starting from the grave, I could discover the history of one of the most important baseball players in the history of this sport. And by the way, this is not the only sportsman I was able to discover in Graceland. Jack Johnson was a name I didn't know. I like boxing. I knew, for example, of course, Muhammad Ali, Rubin Carter, Mike Tyson, Rocky Marciano. I have no idea who Jack Johnson was, and I had no idea how important Jack Johnson biography is to understand many elements of American history, from segregation to sport as an instrument to empower minorities and so on. So Graceland was the starting point of my trip into the heritage of the African-American community in Chicago. And then I kept visiting cemeteries. Oak Woods is another cemetery which is located in the south side, where I went for the first time a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, looking for Italian physicist Enrico Fermi. And of course, I knew this guy. I was so impressed, so happy to be able to see Jesse Owens' funerary monument. Jesse Owens is one of my favorite sportsmen of all time for obvious reasons. And it was kind of easy to find his grave. It was kind of sad to see the grave without many flowers or signs of the presence of visitors. But of course, Jesse Owens is one of the most interesting graves to me in Oak Woods. And starting from Jesse Owens and visiting this beautiful cemetery, I was able to, once again, know more about the history of Chicago and know more about the history of a great woman, which is very much connected to Chicago, Ida B. Wells, for example. That was a great discovery to me, this gravestone, because thanks God we are in the 21st century. So you look at the grave, you take your phone, you open internet, and you can know many things about, for example, this wonderful, wonderful woman. And this is one of the other graves I was able to see and photograph in Oakwood. Harold Washington, I knew the name because of the beautiful library. Now I know more. I know more because I was able to visit the funerary monument, read the epitaphs, the inscription, and then keep going on and reading about the contribution of Harold Washington to Chicago history. After Graceland and Oakwoods, I start being curious about the number of personalities, again, mostly African-American personalities I didn't know. So I asked my friends, where should I go in order to visit more African-American cemeteries? And they told me, Michelangelo, you should go south. You should visit the south side of Chicago. You should make a trip in the traffic of Chicago and visit a couple of other places, which is something I did. So I traveled south and visit Burr Oak Cemetery. To be honest, before visiting the cemetery, I Googled Burr Oak Cemetery on the internet. And actually, it's crazy because the majority of the information I found about Burr Oak, they were related about a scandal that happened in probably 2009 involving the exhumation of bodies and the selling of plots to new families. That was a huge scandal. And that was the welcome to Burr Oak. And when I visited this cemetery, I realized that the cemetery is obviously very different from Graceland and Oakwoods. Just like the city of the living, you have different neighborhoods and the landscape can be radically different. So no big monuments in Oakwoods, no big chapels, not many trees, a different landscape. And in the middle of this flat cemetery, one monument catching my attention. Again, I have no problem in admitting the things I don't know. I have no idea before moving to the US who Emmett Till was. I have no idea how important this poor young man still is, in order to understand the painful history of African-American community in the US. And I was fascinated by the flowers and the homage. And at the same time, I was scared about the facts. How could I don't know this guy? And then I asked the question to my students. I'm teaching, and currently teaching as an adjunct faculty in 2 universities. So I asked my students, about 75 people, 3 different classes, do you know who Emmett Till was? And my students are all about 18, 19, 20 years old. And that was the answer. And that was, I mean, that was scary, because once I learned the history of Emmett Till, the fact that the majority of my students today, they have no idea who Emmett Till was, that was scary, and kind of strengthened my idea that cemeteries are educational places and can be very important to help my students. The same thing I did. I visit a cemetery, I learn about a person, I learn about history, I recognize the importance of memory, collective memory to today society. And of course, Emmett Till was the starting point, and to be honest, was the only grave where I could find some kind of collective homage to this guy. The Queen of the Blues, Dinah Washington. My wife, she loves jazz. She knew Dinah Washington. I didn't. I have YouTube. Now I'm constantly listening to Dinah Washington. And I know who Edward Charles was, another boxer. And living in the US and trying to understand baseball, I know now who Jimmy Crutchfield was and how important he is as a part of the baseball movement. So the visit to Burr Oak was one more element to pushing me to not stop visiting cemeteries, to better understand the history of Chicago, and in particular the history of the African-American community. So Burr Oak, and south, maybe even more south, almost at the limit between the city and the countryside, Mount Glenwood Cemetery. This is a beautiful place. I enjoyed Mount Glenwood. There is no wall, no railing. One of the limits of the cemeteries is the railroad. So you have the cemetery, you can see the picture, you have the graves, and then you have the railroad, and then you have the countryside. That was fascinating. And even more fascinating was the number, again, here too, of people I didn't know, and I know now. Again, Edith Wilson. I know there are 2 Edith Wilson. One was a first lady, that's the wife of President Wilson, and the other one is a blues singer I can listen to now, again, because we are in the 21st century, we have YouTube. So I go to the cemetery, I discover a grave, I turn on internet, and I can travel back in time, and I can know how beautiful was her voice. I have no idea who Susie Edwards was. Just like, and I'm a passionate of bikes and cycling, I had no idea who Marshall Major Taylor was. And that's interesting because here you have a bronze monument with an epitaph telling you the history. So you have internet, but still, even if you're not traveling with your phone, you can still understand the importance of this world champion for the sportsmen in the US. And staying in the sport and focusing on another American sport, football, I was able to read about the beautiful history of Duke Slater. Again, Edith Wilson, Susie Edwards, Marshall Taylor, and Duke Slater, they were unknown to me. Again, ignorance, foreigner, you can choose, but I had no idea who there was. Now, there is one grave I found in this cemetery. I definitely knew who this guy was. And this is, in my opinion, an important grave. Elijah Muhammad. You maybe you don't know who Elijah Muhammad was, but you definitely know who Malcolm X or Muhammad Ali were. So this grave is, in my opinion, a wonderful place to talk about the African-American movement, the civil rights movement, Islam in the US, and many other elements. So that was probably the grave I spent more time thinking about after my trip to this cemetery. And again, look at this grave. Remember Dinah Washington grave. Remember Izzard Charles grave. Remember Ida B. Wells grave. Remember Harold Washington grave. What's the feeling I had visiting this grave? A feeling of emptiness. Where are the living? Okay, I come from Europe. Okay, my PhD dissertation was about Père Lachaise Cemetery, the most visited cemeteries in the world. So I'm used to people visiting cemeteries and looking for personalities in cemeteries. So that's why maybe I was so impressed by the emptiness of these places. Where are the living people? Why people are not visiting this grave, taking advantage of many things? For example, the fact that cemeteries are free, are always open, even on Sunday, are places where you can safely go and learn. I mean, I have no problem in recognizing the importance of other educational tools, books, documentaries. We need more books. We need more documentaries. It's important to read and watch. But is it also important, in my opinion, to remember cemeteries? We need cemeteries as educational places, especially because even if many monuments are made of stone, stone is fragile, marble is fragile, bronze can be fragile. So we run the risk of losing this heritage if we don't visit these cemeteries, if we don't talk about these graves, if we don't recognize the importance of preserving these places. By the way, after my visits to Chicago cemeteries, I spent a lot of time looking on the internet for some good news, and thanks God I was able to find them. Thanks God I was able to find, for example, some pioneer example of protecting and preserving African-American cemeteries in South Carolina. And this is a publication you can download on the internet, and it's fascinating. I was absolutely fascinated by this project, the Killer Blues Project, meaning people looking for musician graves and putting headstones in unmarked graves, helping the memory of the blues being alive. So this is an ongoing project. Some of the monuments you have seen, they were made by this association. They have an interesting website in the internet, as well as Jimmy Crutchfield grave. The grave you have seen was possible thanks to the effort of the Negro Leagues Baseball Grave Marker Project. So there are people already understanding the importance of cemeteries. And moreover, there are cemeteries understanding the importance of their heritage. I want to highlight Bar Oak exactly because when you open Bar Oak on Google, you see a lot of bad things about an old scandal, which we must remember, but it's also important to highlight the commitment of Bar Oak in organizing activities with high school, in enhancing their heritage. So cemeteries are also working, are also understanding their social importance, the importance of their heritage. And let me be proud, I also was able to work with one of my students, Wendy Valerio, on a specific project on Baroque. So she was able to go to Baroque, focus on African-American graves, and starting a little big project I'm very, very proud of. So just to conclude, we need cemeteries. Cemeteries matter, cemeteries matter too. They are important to define a community. They're important to remember the history and the cultural traits of a community. When you visit, like I did, Oakwoods, Burr Oak, Mount Glenwood, or even Graceland and many other cemeteries, you are visiting open-air museums. And in the case of Oakwoods, Burr Oak, and some other, you're visiting open-air museums of the African-American history in Chicago. And in these free museums, you can see both the dark side of African-American history, racism, racial injustice, segregation, but you can also discover powerful history of resilience and empowerment. Cemeteries are open air classrooms. That's I define myself as an activist for cemeteries. So my invitation is, please don't forget how important cemeteries can be to think about our society, to reflect on education, on politics, on civics, on social justice, and public health. I will give you just the last example. I know how much Chicago struggle with gun violence. Every weekend is a carnage. I know how many young lives are lost every week because of gun violence. And I know that not because I can listen to the shooting. I'm fortunate enough to live in West Loop. So the only way I have to know about the killings in Chicago is TV, internet, and newspapers. Actually, that's not true. Actually, I had another way to see what's happening in some places in Chicago. Cemeteries. Of course, I have covered the names, but trust me, visiting some of these cemeteries is a painful trip in the middle of the gun violence, in the middle of too many young lives taken and lost forever. That was the most painful part of my visit. So yes, we need cemeteries, and we need cemeteries to help us better understand our society. These are some of my DePaul students. They love to visit cemeteries with me. And I truly believe it is time to promote the social and educational value of cemeteries, not just for us, but thinking about these people and thinking about these people, we have to do that for the future generation. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for my Italian accent. And please, this is the beginning. I need your help. I need your suggestion. I need any help you can give me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelangelo. If you can. So thank you, Michelangelo. I don't know if people can, it looks like you can hear me. Sorry, my Zoom is having a few issues, but that was a really interesting session. We have just a couple minutes for questions. I'm unable to see the chat. So if you want to unmute and ask your question, feel free to do that. Apologies for that. I'm just curious though, Michelangelo, if I was one of your students in DePaul, could you just talk to me about what would be our experience at the cemetery? Would there be, do you have kind of a prompt or an assignment you ask them to look for? Or how do you help them to make these connections that you've illustrated so powerfully today?
Thank you very much for the question. Very quickly, we have 10 weeks, and in these 10 weeks, 4 weeks are dedicated to the visits of some cemeteries. Of course, the first couple of weeks are in class, preparing the visits, and then in general, we do the visit to a cemetery, and the week after, we discuss the cemetery. So the visit to the cemetery is prepared. I take advantage of internet and D2L to share with my students material, information. And the most important thing, I can count on one thing, the surprise they have about how interesting a cemetery can be. Many of them, they go to cemeteries with very low expectation, you know, stereotypes, stigma. And this is good because when you start with low expectation, you can only go up. And many of them at the end of the course, they tell me, hey, Michelangelo, that was great. I will never think that a cemetery can be so fascinating. And that's the best reward I can have from a student. Thank you for the question.
Hello, Michelangelo. My name is Kathleen Cudia, and your presentation was very interesting. Although cemeteries can be repositories of cultural history, they are also sacred places to those who have loved ones entombed there. So how can someone visit, how can someone, or an instructor with a class, visit a cemetery in a respectful way without turning it into, well, I mean, you have referred to it as a museum, and museums can be considered tourist attractions. So how does a class go about this, and how does an instructor go about this, so that way, if you're taking a group of students, or if there are people there who may be mourning their lost loved ones, how can they go about this in a respectful way?
Thank you very much. This is a great question. First, I always like to remember that we visit a lot of other places in general which are sacred: churches, cathedral, monuments, and they're also tourist places. So it can be done. Of course, in the case of cemeteries, you're very right. There is the question of the people mourning their beloved ones. So for my experience, there are two ways. First way, if you're visiting the cemetery in group, you always have to contact the cemetery. For example, in Chicago, I have a wonderful experience with my students at Rose Hill or Graceland, because they are able to help you. You schedule the visit, and they do all they can to make your visit interesting without complicating things for the people using the cemetery as a resting place. If you're visiting the cemetery alone, in couple, in 3 people, I will say even the Père Lachaise, welcoming 2 million people per year, can be both a tourist place and a sacred place. And in case of Chicago cemeteries, I think that for now we don't have this problem, because they're mostly empty, in particular the cemeteries in the South Side. So before they will become tourist places, I hope they will be educational places. And in this case, it's important, again, to start the visit maybe alone, to people in little groups. And then if you want to organize a bigger visit, you make contact with the institution, you be sure there is no service, no events, and then for sure you can take advantage of the educational potential of cemeteries. But you're absolutely right. We have to always remember that even the most beautiful cemetery is still a sacred place, and we have to behave accordingly with the emotional landscape of that place.
Okay, is there any other additional questions?
Yes, this is Janet Harper, and I have a question about headstones. Usually when someone dies, the family puts up the headstone, decides what's on that headstone. But in your presentation, you mentioned that there are groups that are putting up headstones. Who gets to, the question for me is, who gets to do that? Who gets to decide what kind of headstone goes on someone that is not your loved one, and what the content of that headstone is, and what does that mean in terms of as you say, a cultural history? This is an outsider putting a headstone on someone's grave.
Thank you for the question. Actually, this is a field I'm still discovering. I mean, there are in Europe, the majority of the association doing this kind of job, they are military association trying to mark the graves of veterans from First and Second World War. Here in Chicago and in the US, for example, I have discovered this Killing Blues Association and the other one on baseball. I still need to contact them to understand the process. But for example, I know that in the case of Jimmy Crutchfield, the baseball player, he was buried in an unmarked plot. So there was no way to discover the place where it was buried unless you go to the administration and you ask for the number of the plot. So they put a new stone where there was no stone. But this is absolutely interesting, and I would like to know more about that. This can be part of my project, working with this kind of association, deciding which memory must be kept and why and how this decision is made, maybe involving or not the family.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks.
All right. All right. Can you hear me? Testing, testing.